Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. So today's video will be about not elves mana dork ramp. So basically just any mana dork that just isn't an elf creature type. This will have, because it doesn't have the tribal synergies, these ones tend to be a little bit less viable, I think, in general. There's a couple of one drops that you might consider, especially, there's one that sees so much play. I'm sure you already know what it is. Other than that, there's only a handful that I think are really viable. And we'll go right into that. Karametra's Acolyte. This is the best one of the whole bunch. It should go in just about any deck that has, if it's mono green and you're not doing a tribal thing and you want to ramp this way, it's a phenomenal card. If you're in 2, even 3 colors, it's still going to be pretty amazing. Because worst case scenario, even if this is your only green permanent on the battlefield at the time, it'll at least tap for 1, which isn't great for 4 mana, but that's the floor. The ceiling's obviously going to be a lot higher. So right here, these 7, including Karametra's Acolyte, are the ones that I think are the most viable if you're going to consider using anything that's a non-elf. If you're trying to avoid elves for some reason, these are the 7 that I think that are actually usable. Whisper of the Wildwoods is another good one, just because it'll at least tap for 1, and again, this one has the possibility of tapping for 2, provided that you have a creature with power 4 or greater. Ilysian Caryatid is a 1/1. It has the ability to tap for 1 of any color, which might matter if you're doing multiple colors. But if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, then you get to add 2, but the 2 have to be the same color. Circle of Elders. This one is a little bit sketchier because if you don't have total power 8 or greater, that is the combined power of all of your creatures, and he provides 2 of it, then he doesn't tap for any mana. But if you do, he taps for 3 generic or 3 colorless. So he actually taps for a good amount of mana, and I think that makes him somewhat viable. He does cost 4 though, so he's not a cheap mana dork. He's not the thing that you'll get out super early. Somberwald Sage is a 3 mana dork that will tap for 3 of any one color. So this one will also help you in multicolored decks. It does have the downside of only casting creature spells. The mana that you produce with it will only cast creature spells. I generally don't like that, but a 3 mana tap for 3, especially if you're in a creature heavy deck, is pretty well worth it. This one does see a lot of play compared to the other ones right here on your screen. I don't know why it would see as much play as it does relative to the other ones. Maybe it's just one of those cases where something shows up on EDH Rec and then people see it and then they start using it and over. I guess the restriction of needing power, 4 or greater, 8 or greater, whatever, maybe that deters more people than it probably should, when I think the requirement of having to spend the mana on creature spells should deter more people than it should. Because if you have even just 5 or 10 non-creature spells in your deck, which I have a deck with only 5 non-creature spells, the potential of not being able to cast those because your mana dork won't allow it is a big downside. But still, taps for 3, and that's usually going to be pretty good. Leafkin Druid, this one will tap for either 1 mana or 2. All you got to have is 4 creatures. So while the other ones require a certain amount of power, this one requires a certain amount of creatures. Still very good, and obviously if you're planning on kind of going wide or just having a board state of several little things like mana dorks such as himself, then the requirement's not that difficult to get up to. And then Nantuko Elder, it's just a 3 mana tap for 2. One is generic, one's colorless, one's green. I think that also is pretty decent, and it's identical basically to 2 of the elves, Greenweaver, Druid, and Elder, Fyndhorn Elder. So it's not a bad rate. Next, we're going to go over a few of the tribal ones, starting with Wall Tribal or Defender Tribal. This one has Axebane Guardian, which will tap for X mana of any combination of colors, where X is the number of creatures with defenders you have. So it's not even like you choose any one color and then add X of that color. You could add any combination. You could add 2 blue, a green, and a white if that's what you have. So this is a very important card for any kind of wall deck. Then Overgrown Battlement costs 2 mana and will give you 1 green for each creature with defender you control. So Overgrown Battlement costs 1 less. It has 1 greater toughness. 2 things that aren't that important, but kind of. But the downside of this is that it's only adding green to your mana pool based on the number of creatures with defender you have. And the main wall decks out there are blue, white, green. I want to say Arcades something. The Strategist, I think, is the wall commander. So the wall tribal decks will probably be 3 colors. Next is Sylvan Caryatid, another 2 mana. This one has hexproof, but will add 1 mana of any color. This one sees a lot of play, presumably in decks that aren't wall tribal or defender tribal, and I don't get that. I understand that it'll fix your colors because it will add 1 mana of any color, and I understand. Well, I have to assume that one reason it sees a lot of play is because it's hexproof, but why should you care about your mana dork having hexproof? If your opponents want to waste their removal killing your mana dork, the old Bolt the Bird, that's not a big deal or shouldn't be a big deal. You should be happy that they're wasting removal on something that will be less useful as the game goes on. Then Vine Trellis, another 2 mana one that'll just add a single green, and Sylvan. Oh, we already went over that, but so you've got 3 of these that cost 2 and only 1 that costs 3. Frankly, I think that these should just see equal play kind of across the board. Sylvan Caryatid has a higher dollar value, so if you're playing wall tribal but budget and you're trying to not spend $7 for a mana dork, then I could understand that one being in fewer decks than the other 3, but these should all see pretty equal play across the board. There's no reason that these should really see play outside of wall decks, and there's no reason that your wall deck shouldn't have these mana dorks in them. Next is going to be for Sliver Tribal, Gemhide Sliver, Manaweft Tribal. They're both 2 mana, and they both see about the same amount of play, which is appropriate. There is a small difference. As some of you know, the old Sliver decks, Sliver cards, will use the text that all slivers have, whatever. And that will apply to any slivers that your opponents might have. And then a few years ago, they started making it so that only slivers you control have, and then whatever. In this case, Gemhide will help all slivers, including your opponents. Manaweft will only apply to your own. But considering the frequency in which you would be in a sliver versus sliver game, is not going to matter much. I mean, you will make the shapeshifters into mana dorks as well, but other than that, it's basically a symmetrical effect that's not going to possibly apply to an opponent. But if you're playing a sliver deck, then you obviously want these cards, and you already know that. Next are a couple of... They're just their own thing. There's not a whole lot of tribal-specific mana dork support for these tribes, but these are the 2 cards that individually do it. Sachi, Daughter of Seshiro, will be for shamans or snakes. This is a commander, actually, that has text that applies to 2 different tribes. One buffs up the toughness of snakes. The other one gives your shamans the ability to tap for 2 mana. So you could build Sachi either snake tribal, shaman tribal, or just do both and make your shamans mana dorks and your snakes a little bit bigger. But that's what she does. Is she applies to the tribes, and you wouldn't likely want her in the 99, even though there are only 28 decks. It looks like that have her as commander, and 543 that use her in the 99. I don't know why you would generally want her in the 99 unless it's part of a different snake tribal commander. Then she would go in the 99 of that, and that's what you'd care about. But she makes more sense as the commander. And then Harabaz Druid, this one will apply to any kind of ally decks. Now, green itself doesn't have that many allies. I think there's like 6 or something, some tiny number where you couldn't realistically make a mono green tribal deck. But there's quite a few. They're spread out throughout all the colors, and most of them have abilities that will, I mean, it kind of fits the word ally very literally, where the more of them you have, they kind of buff each other up in somewhat of a sliver way. You know, that tribe, that creature type wants it to be a tribal deck. And in his case, he allows you to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of allies that you control. So this one only goes in an ally deck. I guess you could put it just individually as a 2 mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool. But why would you do that? There's plenty of other 2 mana, add 1 to your mana pool. It doesn't make sense why you'd go for this, unless you're just doing it as a joke. So now that we've gotten some of the tribal ones out of the way, let's go to the ones that are just 1 mana. Birds of Paradise, Gilded Goose, and Honored Hierarch. Now, Birds of Paradise sees a ton of play. It's one of the most common cards in green in the format, and this is where the whole bolt the bird thing comes into, where that expression came into existence, because it was very well known in the one-on-one formats early on that you wanted to get rid of the mana dork early to stop the green player or the person with green from ramping up into something bigger. So you delay their threats and do that. In Commander, that's less of a worry. Yeah, you do want to stop the green person from ramping, but if you're playing the Birds of Paradise and your opponent decides to waste their removal spell on it, there's 4 players, and you the individual only have so much removal. So if you're dumb enough to waste it on a Birds of Paradise, that's going to help the person with the Birds of Paradise. The green player, are going to come out on top of that. Also, lightning bolts aren't really common in the format. So Gilded Goose is significantly worse in my opinion, because you have to sacrifice a food in order to get the mana, and it gives you 1 food on its own. It has the ability to create more at the cost of mana, which you also have to tap it to do that. I don't know that this one should really see any play as a mana dork. If you want it as a flyer, if you're just trying to put it together a deck with as much green flyers as possible, which I think one day I might do, he makes sense for that. If you're doing things that care about tokens, if you're just trying to create the food tokens for the sake of having tokens or artifacts, if you're trying to go infinite with gaining life, if you have a way to untap them and tap them and generate infinite mana and infinite food and gain infinite life. But as a mana dork, he just doesn't make very much sense. Honored Hierarch is another one that even the first turn, because he has to be renowned in order to tap for mana, and the way to become renowned is to attack and deal combat damage to an opponent. That means that best case scenario, you get him out on turn 1, you attack with him on turn 2, turn 3 he's a mana dork. That's a lot tougher of a restriction, because it doesn't even need to just have a 1/1 counter on it. If you put a 1/1 counter on it from another source, that's not good enough. That doesn't make him renowned. So I'm not really big on this card, and I don't think that it should see very much play, which it doesn't. But I'm not big on really any of these cards. I get the Birds of Paradise because it helps for 3, 4, 5 color decks, but overall, if you're doing one of those, you mostly want to fix your lands and ramp in other ways. Birds of Paradise isn't going to be a good long-term solution. Good turn 1, but after turn 1, its value goes way down, I think, in my opinion. So next, let's go on to the 2-mana Dorks. These are mostly colorless ones. You got Hedron Crawler, which will add a colorless, Plague Mirror, which will add a colorless, Manakin, which will add a colorless. The main difference between these is that the Plague Mirror has Infect, so that goes in Infect decks, and that's basically it. Other than that, they're all the same. I don't really see much reason why you'd want any of these in a green deck. I can understand them more if you are playing a artifact-centric deck and you're trying to just get as many artifacts in play as possible. These are artifacts, they're creatures, and they're mana dorks. They can fit a few different categories in that case. But otherwise, there's not a great deal of reason to want to play them. Because even if you just play a different 2-mana dork, those ones, by not being artifacts, are less vulnerable to removal because they'll only die to creature-based board wipes. These ones, you're just opening them up to even more potential removal without getting any extra benefit. Magus of the Library, this one both is a mana dork and potential card draw. I don't like the card draw restriction because it requires you to have exactly 7 cards in hand, and it's a little bit tougher to guarantee that. The ability to tap for a colorless mana also is kind of underwhelming, especially since he does cost, as a 2-mana mana dork, he costs double green, which is good for devotion purposes if you have a Nykthos or anything that cares about devotion, like the Karametra's Acolyte, but he's not a very good mana dork, and he's not a very good card draw. Put them both together, and he kind of fills a good utility slot halfway, but still not something that is a must run or a must include. But it is worth considering because he does offer 2 pieces of utility at kind of an okay rate. Humble Naturalist, also 2 mana. This one's got a little bit bigger body, so if you happen to be running like a wild pair or something, you could, he has total power toughness of 4, so he will help you to get other things. He is a Druid, so that has good tribal synergies if you happen to be playing like the Seaton deck. He's a human, which there's a lot of support for that, and I understand that there are some it's pretty easy to build a human deck if you wanted to. So he'll at least contribute towards that. And he has the benefit of adding 1 mana of any color. But again, he has that downside of only being able to use the mana to cast a creature spell, and I generally don't like that. And another reason why I don't like it is because suppose you're having a turn where you intend on casting a lot of things. Generally, the way that I would suggest doing it is starting by tapping your lands first. That way, if you get to a point where you're down to, you don't have enough mana to cast anything else, at least your 2 or 3 mana dork creatures are untapped so that they could block or even attack if you really wanted to. If you have something that requires the mana to be spent in a certain way, like Humble Naturalist, I would suggest tapping him right out of the gate very early on so that you know that you'll be able to use that mana. Because if what you end up drawing into, what you end up wanting to cast later in the turn is a non-creature, if you've already tapped your lands and you're relying on mana dorks at that point, now you are unable to do it because you don't have mana that's eligible to be spent. So cards like him and the Somberwald Sage from before, I would suggest tapping them earlier in the turn, which kind of compounds why I don't like them as much, why I don't like that restriction very much, because it does change the order in which you want to add mana to your mana pool, because you want to prioritize getting the mana that you have to spend a certain way, which means that you can end up not having the blockers or not having the extra attacker, which I know that they're weak, they don't have very much power, but if you're doing it like an overrun effect, you just need as many creatures on board as possible. It doesn't matter if their base power is like 1, if they're 1/1 tokens, but they all have +10/+10 from a Finale of Devastation, then you just need as many of those weak creatures as possible. So that I think that's a good way of kind of going over why I don't like that restriction. But let's move on. Let's look at some more 2 mana tap for a single. These are going to be Coppermere, Werebear, Orochi Sustainer, Golden Hind. They all tap for a single green. Werebear does have a threshold where he gets bigger depending on what's in your graveyard. I think, 7 or more cards. You don't generally care about the power buff on a mana dork. Although that does mean that if he comes out early, he's a mana dork. If he comes out later, he's a 4/4. Not a huge deal or difference, but, he does have potential upside. But the Sylvok Explorer here, he'll add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. So if you're in multiple colors, your opponent has some kind of land, he'll be able to tap for any of those colors, and so that can help you fix your colors a little bit. If you're playing a mono green, then he at best taps for a green if one of your opponents has a land that'll produce green. At worst, he will basically just produce a generic mana for the mana cost of any of your things. None of these creatures are really awesome, but at least they tap for colored mana, unlike some of the ones that were on the previous page. Those ones were mostly colorless. These ones will at least give you green, so they're a little bit better in that regard. Coppermere is an artifact creature, so that one does have the extra removal vulnerability. Also, unlike some of the other colorless cards that tap for mana, because he taps for green, that means that he doesn't go in any color deck, like the previous ones, Milliken and them, or Manakin, Plague Mirror, and Hedron Crawler. Those can go in any color deck. So white decks, red decks, they'll all want them. Coppermere only goes in a deck that has green in it, and green has better mana dorks or other better ways of ramping. So he's not even great in what he applies towards. So he should see probably less deck. The Werebear, the reason why that one sees as much play as it does is almost certainly because of Bear Force 1. Also, he is a Druid, so I'm pretty sure that he sees a decent amount of play in like Seaton's decks. The Orochi Sustainer will see play in the Snake decks or Shaman decks, but especially the Snake decks. Moving on, we've got some more 2-drops. Utopia Tree will add a mana of any color. Drover of the Mighty, that one will give you a mana of any color. Channeler Initiate, that one will give you a mana of any color, but it does have... it's either synergy or it's a non-bow, depending on what you're doing. If you're playing the Malira, the commander that will say your stuff can't have 1/1 counters put on it, he enters without the 3/1/1 counters, so -1/-1 counters. So he's just a 3/4 creature for 2 mana, which is good value, but not so much important in Commander. But he won't be able to tap for mana. It's just not possible. If you have a deck with a lot of proliferate effects, Doubling Season would not be good in this case because you would enter with 6 -1/-1 counters and immediately die. But if you had proliferate effects, if you had other things that might put -1/-1 counters, then you can maybe turn it into an infinite combo or get into a loop where you get extra value by putting more -1/-1 counters on them to add more mana. But if you just played it straight, you'd put 3 -1/-1 counters on it, which means that it has the potential to tap for mana 3 times. And I don't like having mana dorks that are only mana dorks for a limited amount of time. I would rather have them be a mana dork for the rest of the game if I want them to be. So that one's more conditional based off of what else your deck might be doing. Naga Vitalist, this one will just give you 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. So if you're in multiple colors, then he will tap for multiple colors. But if you're partially mana screwed, then or color screwed by your lands, then there is a restriction there that you won't be able to just use this mana dork to get whatever other color you need. So it's kind of imperfect in that regard. But next, Harvester Druid. This one will again give you 1 mana of any color that a land you control could produce. So same thing as Naga Vitalist. It just different art, different name. Personally, I like the art on that one, but I still don't necessarily like it too much. They're 2 mana, which isn't a terrible value cost for a mana dork. There's only a few that are 1 mana that you already saw: Birds of Paradise, Gilded Goose, and Honored Hierarch. So it's not a terrible rate, but I would generally prefer and suggest that if you're in multiple colors, you still use the land-based ramp as opposed to this. I don't think relying on mana dorks for color fixing is usually a great idea. So next we will move on to the flip cards, the two-sided ones that are kind of a pain to track. Scorned Villager will flip into Moonscarred Werewolf. Moonscarred Villager is only 2 mana, but it'll tap for a green. And it has that text: at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform it. Then the Moonscarred Werewolf has Vigilance, is a 2/2, and will tap for double green. But at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells, transform it. So I don't like cards like this just because they're a pain to track. You have to be paying a lot more attention to not just what's cast and what your opponents are doing, what abilities they're doing, what their combat is, but just having a numerical count of what how much they're casting. But the ability to tap for 1 mana for 2, costing 2, not terrible value. The ability to tap for 2 for something that only costs 2, that's actually pretty good if you're willing to go through the hassle. Overgrown Captive, 2 mana, tap for a single green. This one does have Defender, but I didn't include it in the Wall Tribal, Defender Tribal cards above previously because he has the ability, one, because he flips over, but for 7 mana you can transform him into Ulvenwold Abomination, which is an Eldrazi werewolf, and this one will tap for double colorless. So the back half of this card doesn't have Defender. It still has a bigger toughness than power. It's a 4/6 on the backside, but unlike the previous cards, Scorned Villager and Moonscarred Werewolf, this one doesn't flip back and forth. This one, you pay the mana to flip it, and once it's flipped to the bigger half, it just stays there. So I don't, as a 2 mana, add 1, it's not terrible value, but it does add Defender, which makes it a little bit worse. Paying 7 mana to flip it so that it'll tap for 2 mana as instead of 1 isn't of good value at all, especially since the 2 mana are both colorless. I don't know that I would really want to pay 7 mana to do that unless you're at a point in the game where you've got tons of mana and you got nothing to do, you have no cards in hand, and you just want a bigger creature. But if that's the reason for justifying playing the card, you're already playing kind of a bad deck that doesn't have card draw or is looking to stall out in the mid to late game. So yeah, I mean, I can understand if you're trying for flip cards, Werewolf Tribal, the Eldrazi side of it, if you're trying for Eldrazi Tribal. But in most decks, these cards just don't fit anywhere. So next, moving on to the 3 mana dorks: Alloy Mirror, Opaline, Unicorn, and Scuttlemutt. So there are a lot of mirror decks, though there are a lot of mirror cards. This one will add 1 mana of any color. It'll apply to like a 5-color deck. You might want it there for color fixing, but I would still suggest sticking to like a Cultivate or Kodama's Reach and just fixing through lands instead. As a 3 mana, add 1. It's kind of comparable to a Mana Rock at that point, and most of the 3 mana ones aren't really the high priorities. The benefit that this would have compared to a Mana Rock obviously, is that it's a creature. So if you have stuff that draws you cards whenever you play a creature or whatever, you would get that value off of this without that you wouldn't off a mana rock. But the downside compared to a mana rock is it's a creature, it has summoning sickness, you have to wait a turn to tap for mana. So generally speaking, I mean, it's up to you to decide whether the down outweighs the good outweighs the bad. If you're just playing a lot of stuff that draws you cards for playing creatures, that can kind of help. But if you're playing 5 colors, I kind of doubt that you're really doing it that way. Opaline Unicorn, this one will give you a mana of any color. Same thing. It sees a decent amount of, I mean, both of these see a decent amount of play. The Mirror at least has Mirror tribal synergies, but neither one's really that good. Scuttlemutt, this one sees a good amount of play in Scarecrow decks. I mean, I have a Reaper King deck, and it makes sense in that deck. Outside of that, not super relevant. And the other ability to make a creature become the color or colors of your choice until end of turn, usually that's not something that's going to matter too much. There are older cards especially that care about the color of a creature. It'll say like something to the effect of destroy a black creature, or target blue creature gets this, do this to a red creature, but only a red creature. There's not very many cards or effects that have been printed in the last 15-20 years that do that. So there's not a great deal of support for it, but if you're going for a deck that is specifically trying to care about the color of things, there's something that'll help with that. Next will be several things that are just overcosted. Centaur Nurturer costs 4 mana. When he enters the battlefield, gains you 3 life, and then will add 1 mana of any color. I was actually pretty excited when I saw this card come out, just because I wanted to include it in my ETB deck, because he just ETBs and gains 3 life, and then he'll add a mana of any color. The mana dork part of it was not relevant to me. I did end up taking him out of that deck a very long time ago as I buffed the deck up and just made it more viable. At the time, it was just kind of random assortment of a variety of ETB effects, so something that'll gain life. There's only a couple of other things that do that on ETB, so he felt like he would kind of help give me a little bit more support for that, just for that reason. But as a mana dork, 4 mana, add 1, not a good value at all. Drum Hunter is the same thing. He'll only add a colorless mana though, so as a mana dork, he's even worse. But he has the ability to draw you cards if you have a creature with power 5 or greater. So he does 2 things kind of mediocre, and he sees a ton of play relative to what I think he should, probably because players look at him having 2 different abilities that they want, mana ramp and card draw. And even though he doesn't do either one of them very well, I think people kind of look at that as being, well, at least he does 2 things kind of mediocre, but put it together, and he pulls his own weight. I think he's probably overrated and should not be at all a priority choice for card draw or mana ramp. He shouldn't see as much play as he does. Oasis Ritualist. This one will add a mana of any color, or you can exert it to add 2 mana. Now, if you're playing a deck that is able to untap your stuff, if you have a lot of untap effects, Seedborn Muse comes to mind as one that'll untap stuff every turn, then you don't have to care about the downside to Exert, where he doesn't untap during your next untap step, because you'll untap him during the other player's turns. If you have any other effects that'll untap all your creatures, or just even a single creature, if you have the ability to do it, then he can be made a little bit better, a little bit more viable. On his own, though, he's not that good. And if you are playing a deck that has a bunch of support for untapping things, then there's still better choices, because you would just want one of the other mana dorks that already tap for 2, or the elf mana dorks that can tap for 5 or 10 or whatever crazy amount. He's not, his ceiling's kind of low, and it's circumstantial even to get that. Warden of Geometries. This one will add a colorless for 4 mana. I get that he could go in Eldrazi decks. He can go in any color, but even the decks that are white or red or black or whatever, they're not going to want a 4 mana dork. You should just be doing other things that are more impactful. The vigilance isn't super relevant. I suppose you could be in a situation where you attack with them, then after attackers are declared or after blockers are declared, you tap them for a mana to cast whatever instant. But for the most part, the vigilance isn't super relevant. Then you get even, well, I guess kind of better value, but at the same time worse. Kozilek's Channeler. This one costs 5, but he will tap for 2. So he's a better value, but he comes out later in the game, which means that you're ramping later in the game, and that's not generally what you should want to do. The final one, Lotus Guardian. This one is awful as a mana dork. Costs 7 mana and will add 1 mana of any color. That's horrible value as a mana dork. The only reason why this one should even be considered viable as playing is because it's a 4/4 flyer. So if you're doing anything with flyers, then maybe, but it's there's a reason it's only in 38 decks, because even if you're doing things with flyers, if you care about flying creatures, I mean, blue, white, red with dragons, black, they'll all have a good amount of flyers. Green doesn't have a very deep pool, but unless you're just trying to have as many as possible and include every flyer eligible, he'd probably be cut from the list. He's not going to make the team usually. So, and especially not as a mana dork. And then the last few are going to be just random assortment of things. Palladium Mirror, 3 mana, add double colorless. This one's a pretty good value for any kind of mana dork. It's basically similar to a Worn Power Stone, because that mana rock costs 3. It enters tapped. This doesn't, but this one's a creature, so it has Summoning Sickness, so it works out. And they both add double colorless. So it's basically like that, but it's more prone to removal because it's a creature. It does have mirror synergies if you're doing anything with mirrors. But it also, as a creature, has synergy with any card draw you might have, Guardian Project, whatever. So, oh, and also if you're in a color that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of ramp available to it, you know, like white or red or something, then this is definitely something that you can consider. But at the same time, like I mentioned, there's mana rocks that'll also give you a similar amount without being creatures. So it depends on what exactly it is you're going for. It's not a terrible value as a mana dork. It just, I don't know, kind of stands out as something that you either have a reason for wanting it or you don't. But it's not something that you just generically throw into a deck. So Sataniel Hierophants is a great mana dork, I think, if you're playing any kind of deck that has a lot of creatures that aren't naturally mana dorks, because it's basically Crypt with Right on a creature. Each creature gains tap to add a green to your mana pool. So this one should probably see more play. Whatever decks that you want Crypt with Right in, you probably want him in as well, just for the redundant effects, and you're twice as likely to draw one of them over the course of a game. So even if he's your only creature on the board at the time, he's a 4 mana dork. He'll tap for a green because it affects him as well. But if you've got a board, suppose you just loaded up your board the previous turn with a bunch of tokens, like a bunch of token snakes or elves or something. This turn you play him, all of a sudden you have access to 10 mana dorks and have gained that much mana. So he's great. He's very great after you've already got a board full of creatures that you don't care about. Yeah, this one should just see more play. This is a really good card. And I do like the art as well. Modiah Channelers, this one, at a cost of 3 mana, he has potential. So this one, he makes you play with the top card of your library revealed. I don't like that effect. I don't want my opponents to know what I'm going to do because it means that they can make better decisions with their removal counters, whatever. And I just don't like that effect ever. But if you're playing a deck that already has several things that make you do that, like the what is it, Garruk's something. It's like an 8 mana creature that allows you to play the top card of your library if it's a creature. There's obviously Oracle of Moldiah. There's the other landfall, the other thing that will allow you to play a land at the top of your library. Crucifix of, I can't think of what it's called, but anything that, if you're already playing a deck with several effects that have the top card of your library revealed, this one isn't terrible. I mean, this one will fit in what your deck is already okay with doing, but I wouldn't want it by itself, or I wouldn't generally want those effects in a deck in the first place. But if you're already leaning into it, then you might as well just keep going further. Also, you would want a lot of top deck manipulation so that you can get what you want, have what you want up there, be able to play it if it's, a land and you have the Oracle out, or if it's a creature and you have the Garruk's, whatever it's called, out. This one has so if the top card is a creature, it gets +3/+3, so it's a 5/5. That's not usually super relevant, but I mean, sure. At least it's a benefit. If it's a land, then it can tap to add 2 mana of any one color. So it's a 3 mana, add 2 mana, which is not bad. I mean, there's a few, like the Green Weaver and the Finhorn Elder, and then Nantuko, that I've already covered in this video, that do that, and I like that, but it'll only do that some of the time. If the top card of your library isn't a land, it doesn't do that. It's not a mana dork at all. So a mana dork that shuts itself off is a pretty big downside that I don't want in a deck. And if the top card of your library is neither a creature nor a land, then this doesn't get any benefit. So I don't like this card. I would not include it in like an elf deck. I would only want it in a deck where you're already going to be revealing the top card of your library anyway, and so it's not, the downside's not going to bother you as much, and it has a little bit of potential upside. And then finally, Shaman of the Forgotten Ways. This is a card that sees a good amount of play, and I kind of want to include it as one of the good mana dorks, because it'll give you 2 mana of any combination to your mana pool, and it only costs 3, and it again has that downside of only being applicable to creature spells, which I don't like. So as a mana dork, it's okay. It kind of almost belongs in that first list of the mana dorks that I would be willing to play that aren't elves. But the reason why I think this card sees most of its play is for the biorhythm effect. The second ability, where for 11 mana you can tap it and probably kill 1 or 2 or just everybody and win the game. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it costs 11, you tap it, and each player's life total becomes the number of creatures he or she controls. And you can only activate that ability if you have creatures with total power of 8 or greater. So if you have him, he has power of 2 plus any number of other creatures that add up to 6 power. Then you can pay 11 in biorhythm. I imagine people find a lot of fun with that, and that's why it's in over 5,000 decks. But as a mana dork, he's good. He costs 3 and he adds 2, but I don't like the downside of it only being able to cast creature spells. So for me, he's less appealing, but I can understand why a lot of people might think he's pretty good, and it's hard to argue with it. He is pretty good because of the biorhythm effect, if you're wanting to win games that way. So that kind of wraps up all of these mana dorks that aren't elves. I think that I made it pretty clear early on that I think that there's only a handful of them that I would really consider as viable. Karametra's Acolyte is the absolute best. That is an all-star mana dork and should go in a ton of decks if you're in 3 colors or less, mono green especially. There's a few tribal ones that have good ones, the walls, the slivers, the allies, and the snake shamans. But most of these shouldn't see as much play as they do. You're better off sticking to elves because there's a little bit better elf synergy, even if it's not an elf deck. So that's it for this time. Thank you.